You absolutely have no business here.
He didn't insult her. He didn't shout. He didn't even look at her. A billionaire simply turned his back on a black woman, and 10 minutes later, $3 billion vanished from his control. No threats and no arguments and no raised voice. Just silence and a system that obeyed her. Have you ever been underestimated because someone thought you didn't matter? Type "seen" in the comments. Subscribe now, because this story isn't about money. It's about what happens when power meets proof and loses. The lobby of Howard Dominion Financial was designed to intimidate, not in an obvious way, not with signs that scream power or plaques listing achievements. The intimidation was subtle, architectural, deliberate. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting polished marble floors that looked more like museum stone than something meant to be walked on. Light poured in from above, clean and cold, bouncing off steel accents and minimalist art that said money didn't need decoration. This was a place where people lowered their voices instinctively. Executives stood in a loose formation near the center of the lobby. Men and women in tailored suits, tablets tucked under arms, earpieces still glowing faintly. They weren't waiting in line. They were waiting in hierarchy. Everyone knew who stood where, who spoke first, who followed. At the center of it all stood Dominic Howard. He didn't need to announce himself. His posture did it for him. Dominic stood with his shoulders relaxed, one hand casually in his pocket. His weight shifted just enough to signal ownership of the space. He smiled as he spoke, not warmly, but confidently. The smile of a man accustomed to rooms bending toward him. People angled their bodies in his direction, eyes attentive, laughter quick and slightly forced when he made a joke that wasn't particularly funny. This was his building, his institution, his world. And then, quietly, it changed. The revolving doors whispered open, and Valeria Campbell stepped inside. No entourage followed her. No assistant rushed ahead to announce her arrival. No one cleared a path. She entered the way people with nothing to prove often do, calm, measured, unhurried. She wore a tailored neutral-toned suit, understated but precise, and carried a structured briefcase in one hand. Her hair was neatly styled, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She paused just long enough to orient herself. The room didn't notice her at first. That, too, was deliberate. Valeria took in the scene with quiet clarity. The executives lined up like chess pieces, the subtle deference in their body language, the way Dominic's presence dominated without effort. She'd seen rooms like this before, hundreds of them, rooms where power thought it was visible. She began walking forward. Her heels made a soft, rhythmic sound against the marble floor. Not loud, not demanding, just enough to be heard by those who were listening. A few heads turned. One executive frowned slightly, unsure. Another glanced down at his phone, then back up. Somewhere near the back of the group, a junior analyst instinctively lifted her phone a little higher, as if sensing, before understanding, that something was about to happen. Dominic noticed Valeria then. Not immediately, not fully. At first, it was just a flicker of awareness, a presence entering his peripheral vision. He glanced in her direction, his eyes sweeping over her quickly, dismissively. And in that fraction of a second, a decision was made. Dominic turned away, not abruptly, not angrily. Deliberately, he shifted his body just enough so that his back partially faced her, angling himself toward his executives instead. His smile widened slightly as he continued speaking, his voice steady, conversational, as though nothing and no one had interrupted him. Valeria stopped walking. She stood there, 3 steps behind him, invisible by design. She waited. There was a pause in Dominic's sentence, a natural opening. Valeria used it. "Good morning," she said calmly. "I'm Valeria Campbell. I believe we're scheduled." Dominic didn't turn around. He lifted one hand slightly, palm outward, a universal gesture for hold on. Then, without lowering his voice, without softening his tone, he said the words that would freeze the room. "I don't meet assistants without clearance." The air changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no audible reaction, but something tightened like a string pulled too far. Conversations around the lobby stalled mid-breath. A woman near the reception desk slowly straightened, her eyes widening. Someone near the back inhaled sharply. Valeria didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She didn't rush to defend herself or explain who she was. Her face remained composed, almost serene, but those closest to her noticed something else, a stillness that wasn't weakness. It was restraint. Dominic chuckled softly, still facing away. "If you have paperwork, you can leave it with compliance," he added. "Someone will get to it." A phone camera clicked on. Then another, subtle at first, screens lifting just above waist level, lenses angled carefully. Not everyone was recording yet, but enough people were, enough to ensure that whatever happened next wouldn't disappear. Valeria looked around the lobby. She noticed the discomfort on faces that wanted to speak, but didn't. The executives who suddenly found the floor fascinating. The analysts who sensed history in the making without fully understanding why. She saw the calculation behind Dominic's posture. The assumption that authority was visual, that silence equaled submission. She had seen that assumption before. Many times. Valeria adjusted her grip on her briefcase and took a single step forward. "Mr. Howard," she said, her voice even, "I'm here for the asset alignment meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock. Dominic sighed. He finally turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at her over his shoulder. The look he gave her was polite in the way people are polite, when they don't think politeness matters. "That meeting is for senior partners," he said. "You're early," and misplaced. A few executives exchanged glances. One of them, a man with gray at his temples and a board-level badge, looked at Valeria more carefully now, his brow furrowed, as if something about her presence didn't align with the story Dominic was telling. Valeria noticed. She also noticed Dominic didn't. She nodded once. "Understood," she said. That was it. No argument. No raised voice. No demand to be respected. Just understanding. The silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation could have been. Dominic turned fully back to his executives, resuming his conversation with renewed confidence, as though the matter had been resolved in his favor. But the phone stayed up, and the room knew, on a level deeper than logic, that something had gone wrong. Valeria took a step back, not retreating, repositioning. She reached into her briefcase, removed her phone, and held it in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the screen, not shaking, not rushed. Dominic laughed at something one of his executives said. Valeria tapped her screen once. The sound was barely audible, but it was the loudest moment in the room. She didn't look at Dominic as she did it. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the executives who were now openly staring. She simply stood there, calm and composed, as the first invisible domino tipped. No one knew it yet, but in that moment, standing in a glass-walled lobby designed to intimidate, Valeria Campbell had just reminded the system who truly controlled it. Valeria slowly lowers her phone back into her hand, her expression unchanged. Nothing seems different. Yet, if you've ever been dismissed before anyone knew your value, drop a fire in the comments and subscribe. This story turns Foz. Valeria Campbell had learned early that visibility was a currency, one she chose not to spend. The moment Dominic Howard turned his back on her in the lobby of Howard Dominion Financial, something ancient stirred in the room. Not anger, not outrage, recognition. The kind that comes when people realize they're witnessing a mistake unfold in slow motion. Valeria felt it too, but she didn't react, because reaction was what loud power required. And Valeria had never operated loudly. She had built her life and her empire on a different philosophy entirely. Years earlier, long before anyone at Howard Dominion had ever heard her name, Valeria had been sitting in a windowless conference room in Zurich, listening to three men argue about markets they barely understood. She was the youngest person in the room, the only black woman, the only one who hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. They mistook her silence for inexperience. When the lead partner finally asked her opinion, almost as an afterthought, Valeria didn't argue. She didn't posture. She simply slid a single document across the table. It was a liquidity exposure analysis. Their projections collapsed in under 30 seconds. That was the day Valeria made a rule she never broke. Power doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when needed. From that moment on, she built Campbell's sovereign assets in deliberate obscurity. No press releases that NO magazine covers, NO panels, or keynote speeches. While other fund managers courted attention, Valeria structured capital. While others chased visibility, she chased leverage, quietly positioning her firm as the invisible backbone behind banks, real estate portfolios, sovereign funds, and institutional liquidity channels that kept entire systems breathing. Campbell's sovereign assets didn't advertise. It didn't need to. Its influence wasn't public. It was infrastructural, and Valeria liked it that way. Back in the lobby, the marble floor reflected Valeria's stillness, as if the building itself were watching her. Around her, subtle shifts rippled through the staff. A compliance officer near the glass elevators frowned at her tablet, scrolling through a calendar that suddenly didn't feel as empty as it had a moment ago. A senior analyst whispered something to a colleague, eyes flicking between Valeria and Dominic. Someone at the reception desk quietly stood up. Dominic noticed none of it. He was still speaking, still smiling, still convinced the room revolved around him. Because Dominic Howard's worldview was simple. Power was loud, authority was visible, and dominance was something you performed. He had built his reputation by being seen. Seen on magazine covers, seen at conferences, seen shaking hands with politicians and CEOs. His presence filled rooms because he made sure it did. He believed respect followed recognition, which was why Valeria didn't exist to him. Not yet. She's probably compliance support, Dominic muttered to one of his executives, not bothering to lower his voice. Or an external consultant. They send these people early sometimes. The executive nodded reflexively, though his eyes lingered on Valeria longer than necessary. Valeria heard every word. She let them pass through her like air. Her mind was elsewhere, reviewing the purpose of the meeting that had brought her here in the first place. This wasn't a courtesy visit. It wasn't symbolic. Valeria had scheduled this meeting for one reason: compliance and asset alignment. Howard Dominion Financial had recently crossed thresholds that required institutional partners like Campbell's sovereign assets to reassess exposure, governance standards, and liquidity safeguards. Billions moved through Dominic's systems, billions that didn't belong to him. Valeria's role was to ensure those assets were protected, aligned, accountable. She hadn't come to be acknowledged. She had come to evaluate, and what she was seeing wasn't promising. Dominic finally glanced at his watch. "All right," he said to his executives, clapping his hands once. "Let's move upstairs. We have real work to do." He took a step forward, then stopped. Valeria was still standing there, still calm, still unmoved. Dominic exhaled, irritation flashing across his face for the first time. "You," he said, pointing vaguely in her direction. "Please coordinate with reception. Someone will get back to you." It wasn't cruelty. It was certainty. Dominic was certain he was right. Valeria met his gaze for the first time, not with defiance, with clarity. "I'm already coordinated," she said. "This meeting affects assets currently housed within your institution." The word assets caused a ripple. A few executives straightened. One of them, a risk officer, tilted his head, studying Valeria more carefully now. Something about her tone didn't match Dominic's narrative. Dominic scoffed. "Everyone thinks they affect assets," he said. "That's not how this works." Valeria nodded once. "That's exactly how this works," she replied. Silence pressed down on the lobby. Dominic laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and turned to walk away. Behind him, Valeria watched his back, and for the first time, she considered whether she should accelerate the timeline. She hadn't planned to act this quickly. Campbell's sovereign assets followed internal rules, as strict as any regulatory framework. No emotional decisions that no public confrontation, that unnecessary escalation. But there was another rule, one that mattered more than the rest. Never allow disrespect to compromise governance. Dominic's behavior wasn't just personal. It was systemic, and systems responded to structure, not sentiment. Valeria slipped her phone fully into her hand. The screen lit up revealing an interface few people in the world had ever seen. No logos, no unnecessary design, just clean authorization layers and a single command pathway reserved for moments when alignment failed. Her thumb hovered. Around her, the room waited, though it didn't yet know it was waiting. The risk officer took a step forward. "Sir," he said carefully to Dominic, "maybe we should—" Dominic waved him off without turning around. "I said we're moving," Dominic snapped. "This is a waste of time." The phones were no longer subtle now. They were fully raised. Valeria exhaled slowly. She tapped the screen. A confirmation prompt appeared. She didn't hesitate. She pressed send. The message contained only one word: execute. Somewhere deep within Howard Dominion systems, alerts began to flicker, quietly, urgently. Dominic Howard was still walking away. "Do you think real power needs recognition? Comment yes or no, and subscribe before the shift happens." Nothing happened. That was the most unsettling part. Valeria Campbell stood exactly where she had been moments earlier, phone resting loosely at her side, posture unchanged. No speeches, no warnings, no visible reaction from the building itself. The marble floors didn't tremble. The glass walls didn't crack. The air didn't shift in any dramatic way. Nothing happened. Dominic Howard took 3 more confident steps toward the elevators. The faint smile still carved into his face. The smile of a man who believed the room had already returned to its natural order. He glanced back over his shoulder once. Valeria was still there, still silent, still watching. Dominic chuckled under his breath and turned to his executives. "See," he said, spreading his hands slightly, as if concluding a lesson. "This is what I mean. People love theatrics, but power, real power, doesn't respond to gestures." A few of the executives nodded automatically. Others didn't. Phones remained raised. Some hands trembled now, not from excitement, but from instinct, the kind that warns you something is wrong even before you can name it. Behind the reception desk, a junior compliance associate frowned at her monitor. She blinked, refreshed the screen, and leaned closer. Her dashboard had changed. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to feel off. She didn't say anything yet. Across the lobby, near the glass-walled risk control office, a young analyst named Trevor Gwynn froze mid-scroll. His eyes flicked left to right, then back again. He refreshed his liquidity panel. Once, twice. A thin line on the graph had dipped, barely perceptible, but wrong. Howard Dominion's short-term liquidity curve didn't dip like that. Not during market hours. Not without cause. Trevor swallowed. "Hey," he whispered to the analyst beside him. "Are you seeing this?" "Seeing what?" she asked, not looking up. Trevor pointed. Her expression changed instantly. Not panic. Recognition. They refreshed together. The dip deepened. Still quiet, still controlled, but undeniably real. Dominic's voice cut through the room again. "All right, people. Enough standing around. We got earnings to protect." He stepped into the elevator vestibule and pressed the call button with a flourish. The doors didn't open immediately. He frowned. Behind him, Valeria remained motionless. She hadn't looked at her phone again. She didn't need to. Campbell's sovereign assets didn't rely on theatrics. It relied on architecture, automated protocols layered so deeply into financial systems that once activated, they didn't announce themselves. They moved. The first phase was always silent. Inside the risk office, Trevor's screen updated again. A second line shifted. This one wasn't subtle. "Wait," he murmured. That can't be right." His colleague was already typing, fingers flying. "This looks like a counterparty pause. But there's no notice." "Check the source," Trevor said. She did. Her face drained of color. "It's internal," she whispered. "But it's not originating from our desk." The word internal rippled outward like a dropped glass. A senior risk manager leaned over their shoulders. "What's going on?" Trevor stood up. "Sir, we're seeing liquidity disengagement across multiple short-term instruments." The manager frowned. "That's impossible. No one authorized." His sentence died as his own tablet vibrated. "Once. Then again, he checked the notification, then looked up slowly toward the lobby. Valeria Campbell was still standing there. Dominic laughed from the elevator vestibule. "What is it now?" he called out. "Did someone spill coffee?" No one answered him. Phones tilted, reframing. Someone whispered, "Why hasn't she moved?" Dominic turned fully this time, irritation flashing across his face. "I said we're done here." He pointed toward Valeria without looking directly at her. "You can see yourself out." Valeria didn't respond. She simply met his eyes. And for the first time since this began, Dominic felt it. Not fear, discomfort. It crept in sideways, uninvited, like a draft through a door he hadn't known was open. He straightened his jacket and scoffed. "This is absurd." From the risk office, the senior manager stepped into the lobby. "Dominic," he said, voice tight, "we need a moment." Dominic waved him off again. "Not now." "Now," the manager insisted. That word landed differently. Dominic hesitated. "Just a fraction. Enough." The manager continued, lowering his voice. "We're seeing automated withdrawals. Large ones." Dominic smiled. "From whom?" The manager didn't answer immediately. He glanced, briefly, involuntarily, at Valeria. Dominic followed his gaze. Their eyes met. Valeria's expression hadn't changed. No triumph, and no warning, and no satisfaction. Just patience. Dominic laughed again, louder this time. "This is ridiculous," he said. "See? Nothing." As if on cue, the main compliance display near the elevators refreshed. Once, twice, a soft chime sounded. Barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. The word pause appeared next to a major liquidity channel. Then another, then a third. The lobby went still. Phones stopped shaking. Someone gasped. Dominic's smile faltered. "What is that?" he demanded. The compliance associate behind the desk stood up abruptly. "Sir," she said, voice trembling, "we're receiving automated notices. Counterparties are disengaging." Dominic frowned. "Which counterparties?" She swallowed. "Multiple." The elevator doors finally opened. No one stepped inside. Dominic didn't move. He looked around, searching for confirmation, for reassurance, for someone to laugh this off with him. No one met his eyes. The risk manager spoke again, quieter now. "This isn't random." Dominic's jaw tightened. "Fix it." "We can't," the manager replied. "These are external authorities executing internal permissions." Dominic turned sharply toward Valeria. For the first time, he really looked at her. She hadn't changed her stance, hadn't moved closer, hadn't raised her voice. She was still holding her briefcase, still calm, still silent. Dominic scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction now. "Did you do this?" Valeria didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was doing something Dominic had never experienced before. It was shrinking the room around him. Behind him, another alert chimed. Then another. A compliance officer leaned toward Dominic and whispered, so softly the phones couldn't catch it, but clearly enough for him to hear. "Sir, something's wrong." Dominic felt it then. The first crack in certainty. Not the collapse. Not yet. But the undeniable realization that whatever Valeria Campbell had done, it had already begun. Pause right here. What do you think she just did? Drop your theory in the comments. The first real sound of collapse was an alarm. It was silence. A deep, spreading silence that swallowed the lobby as screens refreshed again, this time without warning chimes, without polite notifications. Just numbers shifting. Statuses changing. Green indicators turning amber. Then red. Inside Howard Dominion Financial. Systems that had never hesitated before were hesitating. Credit lines paused. Not canceled. Not revoked. Paused, like a hand hovering inches above a breaker switch. A senior trader on the mezzanine level stood abruptly from his desk. "Why are our overnight facilities frozen?" No one answered him. Another analyst shouted from across the floor, "Municipal bonds are unwinding." "Who authorized this?" A third voice followed, sharper now. "Counterparty trust flags are triggering across 3 markets. The word trust rippled through the room like a curse. Trust wasn't something you lost suddenly. Trust was something that evaporated when authority withdrew its consent. And somewhere deep in the architecture of Howard Dominion's financial ecosystem, consent had just been revoked. Valeria Campbell stood exactly where she had been since the beginning. She didn't move when the first trader ran past her toward the elevators. She didn't flinch when a compliance officer nearly collided with her in a rush to the risk office. She didn't look up when voices began overlapping, questions stacking on top of each other, urgency replacing confidence. She was not the storm. She was the absence that allowed it. Dominic Howard still hadn't been told. That was the cruelest part. While systems recalibrated and safeguards disengaged, while liquidity drained with surgical precision, the man whose name crowned the building remained uninformed. Not because people wanted to humiliate him, because protocol didn't require his permission anymore. On the 42nd floor, the board notification system activated. Encrypted messages went out. Priority 1. Unscheduled liquidity event detected. Source. Authorized external command. Response required. Board members received the alert simultaneously on tablets, phones, secure laptops. Dominic did not. In the lobby, he was still trying to reclaim the room with posture. "This is a systems glitch," he said loudly, forcing a laugh that no longer landed. "We'll correct it." A junior executive shook his head, eyes fixed on his screen. "Sir, this isn't a glitch." Dominic snapped. "Then what is it?" The executive hesitated, then answered honestly. "It's execution." The word hit wrong. Execution was what Howard Dominion did to markets, not the other way around. Dominic turned, scanning the room again, this time with urgency bleeding through his composure. Who initiated this? No one answered, because no one knew yet, except Valeria, and she wasn't speaking. On the mezzanine, a counterparty liaison watched in disbelief as long-standing trust markers blinked out. One by one, institutions that had worked with Howard Dominion for decades were disengaging, not dramatically, not angrily, but cleanly, like doors closing quietly down a long hallway. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "They're not accusing us of wrongdoing." Her supervisor replied grimly, "They don't have to, because this wasn't punishment. It was precaution. Capital didn't wait for explanations. It responded to authority. And Campbell's sovereign assets had just spoken in the only language systems respected. Dominic felt the room turning against him before he understood why. He stepped forward, voice rising. Why is everyone looking at her? All eyes flicked instinctively toward Valeria. Phones adjusted angles. Someone whispered, "She hasn't moved." Dominic scoffed again, but the sound cracked midway. "You think she's responsible for this?" He laughed sharply. "This woman?" Valeria finally spoke. Not loudly, not sharply, just enough. "Sir," she said calmly, "I'd advise you to stop guessing." The room stilled. Dominic stared at her, anger flashing. "You don't get to advise me." Valeria nodded once. "You're right." She fell silent again. And somehow, that silence felt heavier than accusation. On the 42nd floor, the board chair stood abruptly from his seat. "Give me a full breakdown," he ordered. "Now!" A compliance director replied, voice tense. "The authorization traces back to Campbell's sovereign assets." The board chair froze. "Say that again." "Campbell's sovereign assets," she repeated. "They've initiated a structure withdrawal, automated, compliant, irreversible unless voluntarily reversed." The room erupted. "That's nearly 40% of our short-term liquidity," someone shouted. "And it's triggering secondary withdrawals." Another added. Others are following suit. The chair didn't sit back down. "Who approved this meeting?" he demanded. A name was mentioned. Then another. Then finally, softly, "Dominic." The board chair closed his eyes. "Get downstairs," he said. "Now." Back in the lobby, the transformation was complete. What had begun as confidence had curdled into panic. Executives whispered urgently. Phones rang unanswered. Security stood uncertain, no longer sure who they were protecting. Dominic stood in the center of it all, still trying to project control, still unaware of how far it had already slipped. Valeria remained still, Not smug, not victorious. Focused. She wasn't watching Dominic anymore. She was watching the systems, watching confirmation layers lock in, watching authority finalize. Then, the elevators open again. This time, someone stepped out. A man in his late 60s, silver-haired, tailored suit immaculate despite the speed of his arrival. A board member. He scanned the lobby once, took into chaos, ignored Dominic entirely. Then his eyes locked onto Valeria Campbell. Recognition flashed across his face. Shock, then understanding. He took a breath and walked directly toward her. The room parted instinctively. Dominic turned sharply. "What's going on?" he demanded. The board member didn't answer him. He stopped in front of Valeria, held her gaze, and nodded once. The lobby held its breath. This is where arrogance meets infrastructure. Subscribe, because the collapse is just beginning. The first real sound of collapse was an alarm. It was silence, a deep, spreading silence that swallowed the lobby as screens refreshed again. This time without warning chimes, without polite notifications. Just numbers shifting, statuses changing, green indicators turning amber. Then red. Inside Howard Dominion Financial, systems that had never hesitated before were hesitating. Credit lines paused. Not canceled, not revoked. Paused, like a hand hovering inches above a breaker switch. A senior trader on the mezzanine level stood abruptly from his desk. "Why are our overnight facilities frozen?" No one answered him. Another analyst shouted from across the floor, "Municipal bonds are unwinding. Who authorized this?" A third voice followed, sharper now. "Counterparty trust flags are triggering across 3 markets." The word trust rippled through the room like a curse. Trust wasn't something you lost suddenly. Trust was something that evaporated when authority withdrew its consent. And somewhere deep in the architecture of Howard Dominion's financial ecosystem, consent had just been revoked. Valeria Campbell stood exactly where she had been since the beginning. She didn't move when the first trader ran past her toward the elevators. She didn't flinch when a compliance officer nearly collided with her in a rush to the risk office. She didn't look up when voices began overlapping, questions stacking on top of each other, urgency replacing confidence. She was not the storm. She was the absence that allowed it. Dominic Howard still hadn't been told. That was the cruelest part. While systems recalibrated and safeguards disengaged, while liquidity drained with surgical precision, the man whose name crowned the building remained uninformed. Not because people wanted to humiliate him, because protocol didn't require his permission anymore. On the 42nd floor, the board notification system activated. Encrypted messages went out. Priority 1. Unscheduled liquidity event detected source. Authorized external command. Response required. Board members received the alert simultaneously, on tablets, phones, secure laptops. Dominic did not. In the lobby, he was still trying to reclaim the room with posture. "This is a systems glitch," he said loudly, forcing a laugh that no longer landed. "We'll correct it." A junior executive shook his head, eyes fixed on a screen. "Sir, this isn't a glitch." Dominic snapped. "Then what is it?" The executive hesitated, then answered honestly. "It's execution." The word hit wrong. Execution was what Howard Dominion did to markets, not the other way around. Dominic turned, scanning the room again, this time with urgency bleeding through his composure. Who initiated this? No one answered, because no one knew yet, except Valeria. And she wasn't speaking. On the mezzanine, a counterparty liaison watched in disbelief as long-standing trust markers blinked out, one by one. Institutions that had worked with Howard Dominion for decades were disengaging, not dramatically, not angrily, but cleanly, like doors closing quietly down a long hallway. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "They're not accusing us of wrongdoing." Her supervisor replied grimly, "They don't have to." Because this wasn't punishment. It was precaution. Capital didn't wait for explanations. It responded to authority. And Campbell's sovereign assets had just spoken in the only language systems respected. Dominic felt the room turning against him before he understood why. He stepped forward, voice rising. "Why is everyone looking at her?" All eyes flicked, instinctively, toward Valeria. Phones adjusted angles. Someone whispered, "She hasn't moved." Dominic scoffed again, but the sound cracked midway. "You think she's responsible for this?" He laughed sharply. "This woman?" Valeria finally spoke. Not loudly, not sharply, just enough. "Sir," she said calmly, "I'd advise you to stop guessing." The room stilled. Dominic stared at her, anger flashing. "You don't get to advise me." Valeria nodded once. "You're right." She fell silent again. And somehow, that silence felt heavier than accusation. On the 42nd floor, the board chair stood abruptly from his seat. "Give me a full breakdown," he ordered. "Now!" A compliance director replied, voice tense. "The authorization traces back to Campbell's sovereign assets." The board chair froze. "Say that again." "Campbell's sovereign assets," she repeated. "They've initiated a structured withdrawal, automated, compliant, irreversible unless voluntarily reversed." The room erupted. "That's nearly 40% of our short-term liquidity," someone shouted. "And it's triggering secondary withdrawals." Another added. Others are following suit. The chair didn't sit back down. "Who approved this meeting?" he demanded. A name was mentioned. Then another. Then finally, softly, "Dominic." The board chair closed his eyes. "Get downstairs," he said. "Now." Back in the lobby, the transformation was complete. What had begun as confidence had curdled into panic. Executives whispered urgently. Phones rang unanswered. Security stood uncertain, no longer sure who they were protecting. Dominic stood in the center of it all, still tried to project control, still unaware of how far it had already slipped. Valeria remained still, not smug, not victorious. Focused. She wasn't watching Dominic anymore. She was watching the systems, watching confirmation layers lock in, watching authority finalize. Then the elevators opened again. This time, someone stepped out. A man in his late 60s, silver-haired, tailored suit immaculate despite the speed of his arrival. A board member. He scanned the lobby once, took in the chaos, ignored Dominic entirely. Then his eyes locked onto Valeria Campbell. Recognition flashed across his face. Shock, then understanding. He took a breath and walked directly toward her. The room parted instinctively. Dominic turned sharply. "What's going on?" he demanded. The board member didn't answer him. He stopped in front of Valeria, held her gaze, and nodded once. The lobby held its breath. This is where arrogance meets infrastructure. Subscribe, because the collapse is just beginning. The refusal didn't echo because it was loud. It echoed because it was final. "No, we'll stay right here." Valeria Campbell didn't raise her voice when she said it. She didn't gesture. She didn't lean forward or harden her expression. She simply declined Dominic Howard's, offer the same way one declines something unnecessary. And in doing so, she changed the meaning of the space. What had been a corporate lobby, polished, performative, curated, became something else entirely, a public record. Dominic felt it instantly. The air thickened. Conversations that had already stalled now evaporated completely. Phones that had been discreet moments ago were no longer pretending. They were held openly, confidently, as if everyone in the room understood the same truth at once. Nothing that happened next would ever be erased. Dominic attempted a smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Campbell," he said, careful now, "surely you understand the importance of discretion." Valeria looked at him, not with irritation, not with challenge, but with something closer to curiosity. "I do," she replied calmly. "That's why we're staying." The sentence landed differently than anything else she had said. Discretion, she implied, had always worked for him. Privacy had always protected him. Closed doors had always erased consequences for him. Public spaces, however, didn't belong to anyone. They remembered. She turned slightly, not toward Dominic, but toward the room, toward the analysts, the executives, the junior associates who had watched her be dismissed without protest, toward the glass walls, behind which entire departments were now frozen, staring. "Discretion," Valeria continued evenly, "is how narratives get rewritten. No accusation, no bitterness. Just clarity. And public spaces, she said, are where accountability survives. Dominic opened his mouth to interrupt. A compliance officer beat him to it. Sir, the officer said quietly, eyes locked on his tablet, the earlier interaction has been flagged. Dominic stiffened. Flagged by whom? The officer hesitated, then answered honestly. The system. The compliance footage, the wide-angle recording that had captured Dominic's deliberate turn away, his dismissive posture, his words spoken with confidence, was already processing. I don't meet assistance without clearance. The sentence replayed silently on screens Dominic couldn't see, but whose existence he felt like pressure against his skin. Howard Dominion Financial prided itself on airtight governance, automated compliance monitoring, risk mitigation protocols designed to prevent regulatory exposure before it happened. Those systems weren't emotional. They didn't contextualize. They didn't interpret intent. They documented behavior. And behavior had just been recorded. Dominic took a step forward. This is being blown out of proportion, he said louder now, as if volume might restore authority. There was no intent. Valeria turned back to him. Intent, she said calmly, doesn't override impact. A few executives flinched. They knew that language. It was regulatory language, the kind that appeared in findings, IN reports, IN settlements. Dominic had used it himself against others. Phones were no longer subtle. Someone near the back was live streaming. Another analyst was clearly recording audio, angling his phone toward Dominic with deliberate precision. Dominic noticed, and panic flickered, just briefly, across his face. He tried to regain control, the only way he knew how, by reframing. Let's be clear, he said, turning slightly toward the room. This institution values diversity, inclusion, respect. The words sounded rehearsed. They always did. Valeria didn't respond immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for the contrast to become unbearable. Then she spoke. If that were true, she said evenly, this conversation wouldn't be happening. No theatrics, no raised eyebrow, just inevitability. Behind the scenes, the consequences continued to compound. The flag footage triggered an internal escalation. That escalation triggered an automated regulatory notice. Howard Dominion's compliance systems were designed to be proactive, especially where public conduct intersected with governance risk. A junior compliance analyst swallowed hard as a notification appeared on his screen. External oversight engaged. Preliminary review initiated. He looked up slowly. Sir, he said, voice tight, we've been auto-alerted. Dominic stared at him. Alerted who? The analyst hesitated, then answered, the Financial Conduct Authority. The room inhaled sharply. This was no longer internal, no longer containable. Dominic turned back to Valeria, his voice dropping. This doesn't need to go further, he said. We can resolve this quietly. Valeria met his gaze steadily. Quietly, she repeated. Yes, Dominic insisted. Without escalation. Valeria shook her head once, almost gently. Escalation already happened, she said. You just didn't notice when it began. The words weren't cruel. They were precise, and they landed with devastating accuracy. The board member stepped closer to Dominic now, not as an ally, but as a boundary. Dominic, he said carefully, we need to pause all discretionary authority. Dominic's eyes widened. On whose order? The board member didn't look away. On the systems. That word again. The system. The thing Dominic had always believed he controlled. The thing Valeria understood better than anyone else. She adjusted her stance slightly, still composed, still unhurried. I didn't come here to embarrass you, Valeria said calmly. And I didn't come here to be acknowledged. Dominic said nothing. I came, she continued, to ensure alignment. She glanced briefly at the compliance officer. The misalignment is now documented. Then she added the sentence that sealed it. And documentation doesn't forget. The room felt suspended, like the moment before a verdict is read. Dominic stood rigid, surrounded by people who no longer looked to him for cues. His authority hadn't been taken. It had been bypassed. Valeria, meanwhile, remained exactly where she had been the entire time. Still, centered, unshaken. She hadn't demanded justice. She had allowed visibility to do the work. A soft chime cut through the silence. The compliance officer's tablet lit up again. He swallowed. "Sir," he said louder now, "we have a regulator on the line." Dominic's heart dropped. The officer placed a device on speaker. A calm, neutral voice filled the lobby. "This is a financial conduct authority." The voice said, "We are initiating a preliminary inquiry effective immediately." Every phone in the room tilted upward. Every breath caught. Valeria didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply stood, present, recorded, undeniable. The regulator continued speaking. "Mr. Howard," the voice said, "are you available to answer a few questions? This is where truth becomes permanent. Subscribe. You don't want to miss what happens next." The withdrawal didn't announce itself with an explosion. It arrived the way real power always does. Quietly, irreversibly, and everywhere at once. At exactly 10:17 a.m., the final tranche cleared. $3.08 billion. Fully exited. No suspenseful countdown to no dramatic alert tone. Just a silent confirmation sliding across internal dashboards. Green turning to gray. Balances zeroing out. Relationships severed with surgical precision. Howard Dominion Financial was still standing, but the foundation was gone. A senior analyst stared at his screen, breath shallow. "It's complete," he whispered. The words didn't need to be loud. They moved through the lobby like a shockwave. Executives stiffened. Phones trembled in hands that had stopped pretending not to record. Someone near the elevator sat down without realizing they had done it. Dominic Howard didn't move at all. He just stared, eyes fixed on nothing, mouth slightly open, posture finally broken. Ratings agencies reacted first. They always did. Within minutes, internal notifications flooded compliance terminals. Outlook, under review liquidity position, reassess counterparty confidence, at risk. Howard Dominion's creditworthiness, once untouchable, once assumed, was now a question mark blinking on screens across 3 continents. And markets hated questions. Bonuses vanished before the hour ended, not symbolically, literally. Compensation dashboards refreshed, recalculating based on risk exposure that no longer existed. Entire incentive pools evaporated. An executive muttered, "My bonus," then stopped himself, because no one was talking about bonuses anymore. They were talking about survival. Partners began pulling away, not publicly, not dramatically, but decisively. A sovereign wealth fund paused negotiations. A European pension group suspended renewals. 2 long-standing counterparties requested time to reassess exposure. That phrase landed like a guillotine. Time to reassess. It meant we don't trust you anymore. Dominic finally turned toward the board member nearest him. "This is temporary," he said, voice thin. "We'll replace the liquidity." The board member didn't argue. He just shook his head. "You don't replace trust," he said quietly. "You lose it once." Dominic swallowed. Another alert surfaced. This one didn't blink. It stayed. Executive override. Suspended. Dominic frowned. "What does that mean?" The compliance officer hesitated, then answered. "It means," he said carefully, "you no longer have unilateral authority over capital movement." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I'm the founder." The officer met his eyes. "Not today." The sentence was devastating in its simplicity. No shouting, no accusations. Just a system recognizing hierarchy differently now. Dominic Howard, billionaire founder, industry titan, untouchable figure, had been reduced to something unfamiliar, a participant, not a controller, not a decision-maker. Just another man in a tailored suit standing in a glass lobby, watching his power dissolve in real time. Valeria Campbell remained still. She had not spoken since the regulator joined the call. She didn't need to. The systems were speaking for her now. Each withdrawal, each pause line of credit, each suspended relationship was a sentence in a language Dominic had spent his life pretending only he spoke. And now it was being used against him. Phones zoomed closer. Someone whispered, "It's really happening." Someone else murmured, "That's 3 billion." The number floated in the air, heavy and unreal. Dominic heard it like a verdict. The regulator's voice returned, steady and emotionless. "Mr. Howard, given the sudden liquidity shift, we are advising immediate stabilization measures." Dominic nodded automatically, even though no one could see him. "Yes," he said, "of course." But the word advising cut deeper than any accusation. It meant he was no longer in control. He was being managed. Valeria finally moved, just slightly. She adjusted her grip on her briefcase, preparing, not for confrontation, but for departure. Dominic noticed. Panic surged. "Wait," he said, stepping toward her before he could stop himself. The room froze. Valeria turned calmly. "Yes." The single word felt heavier than the billions that had just exited his institution. Dominic searched her face. This woman he had dismissed without a glance. This presence he had tried to erase with posture alone. And for the first time since she entered the building, he saw her, not as a threat, not as an adversary, but as a reality he had refused to account for. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't know who you were." The sentence slipped out before pride could stop it. And the moment it was spoken, Dominic knew it was already too late. Valeria studied him for a heartbeat, not with satisfaction, not with anger, with something closer to inevitability. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly the point. No lecture, no condemnation, just truth, delivered without volume." Behind them, systems continued recalibrating. Howard Dominion stock dipped, analysts revised forecasts, news alerts began firing across financial media. Unexplained $3 billion liquidity exit triggers market concern Howard Dominion under regulatory review after public incident. The story was no longer controllable. It had escaped. Dominic stood there as Valeria turned away, not storming out, not triumphantly exiting, just walking, steady, composed, untouched by the chaos she had unleashed simply by being seen. Executives parted instinctively to make room. No one spoke. No one stopped her. As the glass doors slid open, Dominic felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not anger, not humiliation. Something worse. Understanding. He had believed power was presence, that dominance was posture, that respect was something you demanded. Valeria had proven, without raising her voice, that power was access. And access, once withdrawn, didn't negotiate. The doors closed behind her. The lobby exhaled. Dominic remained where he was, surrounded by screens he no longer commanded, people who no longer deferred, and systems that no longer answered his name. $3 billion gone. Not stolen. Not destroyed. Simply removed. Because disrespect had finally met consequence. Dominic stared at the spot where Valeria had stood and whispered again, this time to himself, "I didn't know who you were." That sentence just changed everything. Comment if you think it should. Valeria Campbell did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room, still vibrating from the $3.08 billion exit, was already listening in a way it hadn't before. Not because of fear alone, but because something irreversible had happened. A truth had been revealed, and once revealed, it could not be negotiated away. Dominic Howard stood a few feet from her, no longer centered, no longer surrounded. The glass and marble lobby that once amplified his presence now exposed him. Every angle reflected a man whose authority had evaporated faster than he could comprehend. "I didn't know who you were," he had whispered. Valeria met his eyes fully now. Her gaze was steady, not sharp, not cold, clear. "That," she said calmly, her voice carried without effort, "is exactly why this mattered." The sentence landed with more force than the withdrawal itself, not because it was cruel, but because it was final. A hush settled. Phones remained raised, but no one moved. Even the regulators on speakerphone went silent, instinctively recognizing this moment for what it was. Not a confrontation, a verdict. Valeria didn't frame her response as a personal grievance. She didn't recount the insult. She didn't replay the moment Dominic turned his body away from her. She widened the lens. This was never about recognition, she continued, or introductions, or apologies. She gestured lightly around the lobby. The executives, the glass walls, the system still recalibrating in the background. It was about governance. That word, governance, shifted the air. Dominic flinched. Valeria spoke not as an offended woman, but as an institutional force. When respect is conditional, she said, it becomes a liability, and liabilities must be managed. The compliance officer nodded instinctively. A board member swallowed hard. Valeria turned slightly toward the regulator on the line. Which is why, she continued, this response will not be personal. Dominic looked up sharply. Not personal? Hope flickered, brief, desperate. Valeria extinguished it without effort. It will be structural. She outlined the reforms with the same calm precision she had used to trigger the exit. No theatrics. No threats. Just requirements. Effective immediately, she said. Any future engagement between Campbell's sovereign assets and Howard Dominion Financial will be contingent on independent governance oversight. One executive scribbled furiously. Mandatory dignity and bias accountability protocols, Valeria added. Externally audited. No internal discretion. Dominic opened his mouth. She continued. Executive authority thresholds will be revised. No single individual, founder or otherwise, will retain unilateral override in matters of asset alignment. The compliance officer exhaled slowly. This wasn't punishment. This was surgery. Valeria turned back to Dominic. You believed power was something you could perform, she said, not unkindly, but unmistakably. That if you didn't look at someone, they ceased to exist. She paused. But power that depends on blindness, she finished, eventually trips over what it refuses to see. The room absorbed the words in silence. They weren't accusatory. They were explanatory. Dominic's face had gone pale. This is excessive, he said, the old reflex kicking in, thin and ineffective. You've made your point. Valeria tilted her head slightly. No, she replied. I protected my position. She gestured toward the exits, where security had begun to reposition, not aggressively, but decisively. And now, she said, this institution has a choice. Her eyes flicked to the board members. Proceed without disruption, she said, or continue pretending this was a misunderstanding. The board chair didn't hesitate. Security, he said quietly. Dominic froze. 2 guards approached. Not rushed. Not rough. Professional. Dominic looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to intervene. No one did. The people who once orbited him now avoided his eyes, because they understood something Dominic did not yet fully grasp. This wasn't exile. It was consequence. As the guards gently but firmly guided Dominic away, the phones followed, but not with glee, with solemnity. The spectacle had ended. What remained was meaning. Dominic turned once more, his voice cracking. You're destroying everything I built. Valeria didn't answer immediately. She waited until he was fully facing her, until the posture that once conveyed dominance now conveyed nothing at all. Then she said quietly, No, I revealed what you built it on. The guards resumed. Dominic was escorted past the glass walls, past the lobby that had once amplified his ego, toward an exit he had never imagined using. The doors closed behind him. No applause followed. No cheers. Just breath. The room exhaled as one. Executives looked at Valeria, not with fear now, but with understanding. She had not humiliated Dominic. She had corrected the system. Valeria gathered her phone, her briefcase, her composure, unchanged from the moment she entered. The regulator's voice returned. Dr. Campbell, they said, we acknowledge your conditions. Valeria inclined her head. Good, she said. Then this concludes my involvement. She turned toward the exit. No speech. No victory lap. Just movement. As she walked, whispers followed, not of gossip, but of recalibration. That was surgical. She didn't even raise her voice. That's what power looks like. Valeria heard none of it. She didn't need to. The work was done. At the threshold, she paused, not for the room, but for herself, for the younger version of her who had learned early that visibility was a risk, for the systems that had taught her silence was safer than confrontation, for the moment she decided that dignity didn't need to be loud to be lethal. Then she stepped forward. Behind her, Howard Dominion Financial was already changing, boards restructuring, policies rewriting, power redistributing, not because of outrage, because of leverage. Valeria walked toward the exit, the glass doors sliding open before her, not in deference, but in acknowledgement. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that inside, a $3 billion lesson had just been taught. Valeria exits the building without looking back. Inside, the system begins to rewrite itself. Power or pride, which one failed him? Let me know in the comments. The collapse didn't explode. It spread, slowly at first, then everywhere. By sunrise, the headlines were no longer asking what happened. They were asking what it meant. The footage replayed on every major network. Muted clips of a man turning away at a woman standing still. Phones raised, systems reacting. Commentators tried to frame it as a miscommunication. The public didn't accept that, because miscommunication doesn't move $3 billion. Financial news anchors spoke in careful tones. This wasn't market fluctuation. One analyst said, this was a structural withdrawal of confidence. Another put it more bluntly. When capital leaves quietly, it means trust has already died. Howard Dominion Financial's stock didn't crash. It sagged, a slow, humiliating dip that signaled uncertainty, not panic. Investors hate panic. They fear uncertainty. Inside the firm, the mood turned surgical. Conference rooms filled with compliance teams. Emails titled independent review and immediate action required flooded inboxes. Risk officers took control from executives who had once overridden them. The system had learned something, and now it was correcting itself. The board released a statement by mid-morning. They announced an internal investigation into workplace conduct, leadership culture, and governance oversight. Dominic Howard's name appeared only once. At the bottom, under the phrase, effective immediately. No farewell paragraph, no legacy language, no tribute. Just absence. Dominic didn't fight it. He didn't issue counterstatements, didn't leak rebuttals, didn't rally allies, because there were none left who could protect him. Power evaporates quickly once systems stop answering your calls. Within days, his profile vanished. Speaking engagements quietly canceled. Board seats reconsidered. Charity affiliations removed from websites. Not out of outrage. Out of risk management. Because no institution wants to be the next headline. The internet noticed the silence, and it interpreted it correctly. He's not being punished, one viral post read. He's being unplugged. Meanwhile, something else happened. Across the industry, meetings changed. Executives grew cautious, voices lowered, assumptions checked. Not because everyone suddenly became enlightened, but because consequences had become visible. Respect, once treated as etiquette, was now understood as infrastructure. Valeria Campbell was nowhere to be found. No interviews, no statements, no victory lap. She didn't attend conferences where her name was suddenly whispered with reverence. She returned to what she had always done best. Silence. Back at Campbell's sovereign assets, operations continued uninterrupted. Trades executed. Compliance reviews completed. Capital allocated with the same precision as always. To Valeria, nothing had changed. She had entered the building to align assets. She had aligned them. The outcome, public, historic, irreversible, was simply the byproduct of integrity meeting leverage. People wanted her to say something. They wanted wisdom. Quotes without a moral takeaway. She declined all requests because the lesson wasn't hers to explain. It belonged to the evidence. Across social media, the story evolved. It stopped being about Dominic. It became about moments people recognized in their own lives. The time they were ignored in meetings. The email that went unanswered until resent from a different name. The introduction that was skipped. People asked themselves a quiet question. How many systems am I trusting that don't see me? Universities assigned the case. Leadership coaches dissected it. Notice, one lecturer said, pointing to the footage, how she never once raised her voice. The students nodded. They understood. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about calibration. Dominic Howard retreated completely. No sightings, no leaks that no come back to her. He moved through private spaces now. Unrecorded, unremarked. For the first time in his career, no one was watching. And for a man who believed power existed only when witnessed, that was the harshest consequence of all. Weeks later, an internal memo circulated quietly through Howard Dominion Financial. New protocols. Mandatory dignity training. Independent oversight. Zero-tolerance language around dismissal and bias. Not framed as morality. Framed as risk prevention. The most effective kind. Late one evening, Valeria received a handwritten note. No return address. Inside, a single sentence. I watched what he didn't say. IT changed how I move through rooms. She folded the paper once, placed it in a drawer, and went back to work. The narrator's voice, steady and reflective, closes a chapter with a question that lingers longer than outrage ever could. What if he had simply faced her, not acknowledged her wealth, not praised her power, just faced her? Because sometimes history doesn't turn on violence or speeches. Sometimes it turns on a moment someone chooses not to look away. Subscribe if you believe respect should never be optional. The lobby looked the same. Glass walls still caught the light. Marble floors still reflected movement. The building still hummed with quiet efficiency. And yet, everything had changed. If you stood where Valeria Campbell had stood hours earlier, you would feel it. Not as noise, not as spectacle, but as absence. The absence of posturing. The absence of assumed superiority. The absence of a man who once believed power was something you could perform with your shoulders squared and your voice raised. Dominic Howard was gone. Not erased, not forgotten. Just removed from the equation. Later that evening, when the footage replayed online, people didn't focus on the moment he looked away anymore. They focused on what happened after. They noticed the stillness, the restraint, the way Valeria never once defended herself. She didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't explain. She documented, and the system answered. The opening clip circulated endlessly. A white billionaire turned halfway from a black woman in a luxury lobby. A dismissive hand gesture. A smirk. People paused the video at that exact frame. Some saw arrogance. Others saw racism. Most saw familiarity. Because everyone had witnessed some version of that moment in their own lives. The dismissal before recognition. The judgment before understanding. The silence imposed by someone who believed silence was weakness. But the story didn't go viral because of that moment. It went viral because of what followed. The timeline slowed the footage down. They highlighted the phones being raised. The subtle shift in body language. The way Valeria's expression never changed. She didn't react. People commented. She didn't have to. That's terrifying. Analysts broke down mechanics. This wasn't retaliation, one wrote. It was authorization. And that distinction mattered, because retaliation is emotional. Authorization is structural. Inside Howard Dominion Financial, the changes were already visible. The executive floor had gone quiet. Not tense, focused. Interim leadership issued new directives. Compliance audits expanded. Independent oversight committees were announced before markets opened the next morning. The reforms Valeria demanded weren't framed as punishment. They were framed as inevitabilities, because now there was evidence. And evidence doesn't care about intent. Dominic Howard released a statement that afternoon. It was brief, carefully worded, legally sterile. He apologized for any misunderstanding and emphasized a commitment to inclusion. The internet wasn't impressed, not because the apology was false, but because it was late, and lateness in systems is expensive. Meanwhile, Valeria Campbell did not release a statement. She didn't tweet, didn't post. didn't authorize an interview. She went home. And in that choice, she reinforced a lesson more powerfully than any speech could have. In the quiet of her private study, Valeria sat with a cup of tea cooling untouched beside her. She replayed nothing. She didn't need to. The work had been done not through confrontation, but through alignment. Alignment of authority. Alignment of systems. Alignment of truth with consequence. She had not changed who she was that morning. She had simply allowed the world to see how power actually worked. Valeria thought back, not to Dominic, but to the first time she learned this lesson, years earlier, in a different room, a different man, a boardroom where her analysis had been ignored until a junior associate repeated it and was praised. She remembered the heat behind her eyes, the urge to speak louder, to interrupt, to prove she hadn't then either. She documented, she waited, she moved her capital elsewhere, and 3 quarters later, the firm that dismissed her collapsed under a liquidity miscalculation she had quietly flagged. No one ever connected the dots. She did. That was the truth that remained. Power doesn't announce itself. It arranges outcomes. Across the city, conversations shifted. At dinner tables, in offices, in group chats. People ask different questions now. Not who is the loudest, but who controls the systems. Not who gets credit, but who holds leverage. And perhaps most importantly, who is being dismissed before anyone knows their value. The story took on a second life. Universities dissected it in ethics courses. Leadership seminars referenced it without naming names. Quietly, compliance departments updated protocols, not because they feared Valeria Campbell, but because they recognized something older and more dangerous than fear. Precedent. A junior analyst at a different firm watched the footage late that night. She paused at the moment Valeria opened her phone. She didn't know what Valeria typed. She didn't know what system responded, but she understood the principle. That silence wasn't submission. That restraint wasn't weakness. That dignity didn't need to be loud to be lethal. The next morning, the lobby of Howard Dominion Financial opened as usual. Same doors, same guards, same light, but no one stood where Dominic once stood. And everyone noticed, not because they were told to, but because absence is one of the most honest signals power ever leaves behind. The final truth of the story was never about a billionaire refusing to face a black woman. It was about what happens when arrogance meets infrastructure, when bias collides with documentation, when someone assumes respect is optional until the invoice arrives. Valeria Campbell never demanded recognition. She didn't correct Dominic, didn't educate him, didn't expose him emotionally. She let the system respond to his behavior exactly as it was designed to. And in doing so, she left behind a lesson that couldn't be argued away, spun, or forgotten. Disrespect isn't emotional. It doesn't scream. It doesn't plead. It doesn't need outrage. It's expensive. And eventually, someone always pays. If this story changed how you see power, like, comment, and subscribe. More stories like this are coming.